has invited me today. I'm going to share my screen now and we'll see what happens. Share and slideshow. Oops. What happened? From beginning. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me. I think the agenda we've set out is I'm going to talk for 40 minutes, it may be 35 minutes now, and about this international law of colonialism, how the United States came to claim the Pacific Northwest. And then, so I'm speaking sort of in general of international law and manifest destiny. And then Brandon Reynon is going to talk about the actual application to the native peoples that lived there and his tribe, and maybe some things even about Vashon Island itself. I am talking about international law. It's one of the earliest forms of international law, the law of the sea, the law of war, and the international law of colonialism, all developed in the 1400s, roughly the same time. The law of the sea was really even later. Hugo Grotius and Spanish authors were arguing back and forth in about 1600. So the law I'm talking to you is how it is really one of the earliest forms. And it's how European Christians developed the idea that they had the right to go around the world, putting their flag and their cross in the soil and claiming rights over indigenous peoples who they thought were savages, maybe even less than human beings, certainly not Christians. So European Christians thought they could make these claims. Now, I want to tell you, I'm not just talking about history. So 600 years of history, I'm going to try to cover in 35 minutes. But I want you've probably heard of this already. Do you know that Russia put its flag on the bottom of the North Pole, 2.5 miles below the surface of the ocean on August the 2nd, 2007? Do you know that China put the Chinese flag on the bottom of the South China Sea in August of 2010? Now, why would they do such a thing? They are literally making territorial claims to jurisdiction over these areas. Russia wants the North Pole because 25% of the Earth's known reserves of oil and gas are under the North Pole. China is claiming the entire South China Sea to the exclusion of Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, Taiwan, Vietnam, etc. There are going to be problems in the South China Sea as these territorial claims are made. But what I am actually talking to you about is how territorial boundaries were defined and established in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, and how the United States came to be the alleged owner of the Pacific Northwest. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about very quickly or today. For some reason, that is the wrong slide. Clear back at the end. Interesting. Okay, let's start here. In the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court adopted the Doctrine of Discovery in 1823, a mere 201 years ago. But in that opinion, the court looked back to 400 years of European colonization and European claims to the world. And what the Supreme Court was trying to decide was who owned certain lands in what's now Illinois and Indiana, and whether the tribal nations had the full ownership of their land so that they could sell it. I won't go into the facts of the case, but Mr. Johnson's grandfather, well, I guess I am going into the facts. Mr. Johnson's grandfather had allegedly bought land from native peoples who claimed they were chiefs out in what's now Illinois and Indiana. And so he was trying to establish his title, claiming his grandfather's company had bought the land directly from tribal nations. Mr. McIntosh, however, was living on the land, farming it, and he had bought the land from the United States in 1818, who had signed a treaty with the tribal nations, the Illinois and Piankashaw tribes, in 1813. So the United States claimed its title through treaty and government relations and sold it on to Mr. McIntosh. Mr. Johnson was based his claim on allegedly purchasing the land in the 1773 and 1775 through his grandfather's company. So the Supreme Court had a pretty important issue to handle. Did the federal government own lands in the West? Did tribes still own it? Did individual Americans own it? So that's all the facts I'm going to cover on the case. It's 30 pages long, but the court used the word discovery, something like 30 sometimes, and as a noun. Not, I'm not an English major, but not as a verb. So they weren't talking about the act of discovering. The court was talking about discovery, and I argue was literally talking about international law that the Europeans, primarily the Spanish, Portuguese, and the Catholic Church, had developed in the 1400s. So Chief Justice John Marshall writes this opinion. It's the first Indian law case decided by the Supreme Court. Anyone that teaches or studies Indian law starts with Johnson v. McIntosh. And these days, almost everyone that teaches property law starts with Johnson, because the fee simple title to lands in the United States comes from the United States primarily. Where did the United States get that title? Native nations, treaties, purchase, sometimes theft, etc. So what did the court? So the court says that the United States was settled on discovery and conquest. And so the court raises the idea of war and what rights the conquering nation acquires when they win a war. King A wins a war against Queen B. What rights does King A acquire? So Johnson discusses that a little bit. But what he also and plainly holds is that the tribes lost their full ownership of their lands when a European or American showed up with and put the flag and the cross in the soil. This was a very significant legal procedure, legal formalistic procedure. Without their knowledge, without consent, and without any payment, tribes lost what today we call the fee simple title. The homes you own the fee simple title. You can give it away if you want. You can sell it to someone for $1. You can sell it to someone for $1 million. You can live on it and do mostly what you want and prevent other people from interfering with you. That right that we call under Anglo-American property law the fee simple title, tribes were held not to have that. And you may even know the phrase tribal trust lands today. That's a similar situation where the United States is deemed to be the legal owner and the tribe is called the beneficial owner. The tribe can neither sell, lease, nor develop their lands without the permission from the United States. So Johnson v. McIntosh and this international law of discovery literally has modern day impact on tribal nations and sometimes on individual Indians too. What else did the court say tribal peoples lost? Well, they lost some of their sovereign rights. The Supreme Court and President Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State, talked about issues like this. Tribes are now only supposed to deal commercially with the country that discovered them, only supposed to sign treaties with the country that discovered them. When Thomas Jefferson was our first Secretary of State in 1792, he had a most interesting conversation with the British ambassador about the Hudson's Bay Company. And Jefferson was telling England the Hudson Bay Company had to get out of the lands south of the Great Lakes because he said, that's our territory, the United States territory. And he said, and I quote, those are our Indians, close quote. So he was telling England and the Hudson Bay Company, you cannot deal politically or economically with native peoples who are inside the boundaries of the United States. The United States still pretty much believes those principles today. So I read Johnson v. McIntosh so many times. I was involved, my tribe appointed me to be involved with the Lewis and Clark expedition back in 2003 and 06. And that's when I did so much of this research and thinking of Johnson v. McIntosh. And after reading that opinion so many times, I decided to break it down into the elements. If you're not a lawyer, this may be new to you, but we break crimes and we break torts. If I get in a car wreck with you and you charge me with negligence, there are 4 elements to the tort of negligence. And if you want to win a lawsuit against me, you have to prove all 4 of those. So I decided, well, what are the elements of the doctrine of discovery? And I guess I forgot to say that. This is why we call this legal principle the doctrine of discovery, is because of Johnson v. McIntosh and Justice Marshall's usage of the word discovery. So I'll go over these very quickly, but you may already see these ideas in American history and in the progress of American manifest destiny to the Pacific Northwest. I'll show you a map later. We'll talk a little bit about Jefferson some more. We'll talk about Lewis and Clark a little bit more. So what are the elements? Europeans developed the idea if they discovered a non-Christian, non-European country first, that was what the flag and the cross was all about. That this European or slash later American country would claim these new areas under the idea of the doctrine of discovery, first discovery. Maybe you know this, but Lewis and Clark carried a branding iron with them across the country. And if you read the journals very carefully, they don't mention that branding iron until they cross the Rocky Mountains into what's now, I guess, part of Idaho and then eastern Washington. And now they start using the branding iron. The branding iron is at the Oregon Historical Society, and you can see it. It was a branding iron with a square part in the middle, and it said U.S. Captain, CAPT period, M. Lewis. I argue that they were using that branding iron to try to prove discovery in the Pacific Northwest and where an American military expedition had been. In the 1550s, Queen Elizabeth I started arguing with Spain and Portugal about discoveries, about empire. She wanted some empire too, and the riches and lands that would entail. So Queen Elizabeth and her lawyers developed this second principle of the doctrine of discovery. Just finding a new area first was not good enough, at least not forever. And this idea of actual occupancy said that a discovering country had to return within a reasonable length of time and build actual buildings, put soldiers or settlers there. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, folks, but Lewis and Clark were doing exactly this. Thomas Jefferson targeted Lewis and Clark at the mouth of the Columbia River, and I'll show you why in a bit. And if you know that great American fur trader, that John Jacob Astor, why did he build the town of Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River? And when he told President Jefferson in 1808 that he was thinking of building a fur trading post, he says, oh, on the Pacific, maybe at the mouth of the Columbia River. Thomas Jefferson, I envision him doing cartwheels down the hall at the White House because he wrote back, oh, do it, Mr. Astor. And I can give you this quote. President Jefferson writes, I will give you all the support the executive can provide, period, close quote. Jefferson was the lawyer. Jefferson knew these legal principles of the doctrine of discovery, and he wanted an American fort built at the mouth of the Columbia River, and then he wanted John Jacob Astor to build a permanent dwelling, a town, a trading post for the United States. Preemption, I'll go through these very quickly. What did Europeans acquire? They did not acquire the fee simple title, folks. They acquired the claim to buy the land from the native peoples to the exclusion of any other country. So some cases call this preemption. Some cases call this the European title. What did Europeans come to own when they came to an island or to the east coast of the U.S. and put their flag and cross in the soil? What were native people left with? They were left with this limited title that I described to you very briefly that today we call the trust ownership, trust lands. Every native person, every tribe knows what that means. I'm not sure that all natives know that this is a relic of 600 years ago and of international law. I've already mentioned this point. So this is another element I saw by reading Johnson v. McIntosh so many times. Tribal commercial rights and tribal sovereign rights as a nation, as a polity, were limited. Contiguity, I'll show you the map in a moment. When a European walked ashore and put their flag and cross in the soil, how big of an area were they claiming? And spoiler alert, here I come, but you know I'm going to show you a map of the United States, and we're going to talk about what the Louisiana Territory is. And we're going to talk about what the Oregon country is and was. Exactly defined by this idea of the doctrine of discovery and contiguity. And again, spoiler alert, Jefferson knew that the finding of the mouth of a river was the crucial element. After making the Louisiana Purchase in the summer of 1803, Jefferson spent the summer at home using his own library to write a 40-page pamphlet trying to trace the discoveries of the French. It's literally called, well, now I'm forgetting on what it's called, French Discoveries of the Louisiana Territory. And he was tracing as the French went down the Mississippi River, building St. Louis, St. Genevieve, When did they arrive at the mouth and establish the town of New Orleans? And now Jefferson knew he had a claim to whatever the drainage system of that river was. And I'll show you the maps in just a moment. This is exactly how the United States claimed the entire Pacific Northwest, the Oregon country. Do you folks know that we claimed all of British Columbia, and we claimed we were going to go to war with England over British Columbia? I now pause as a law professor and ask you a rhetorical question. What was James K. Polk's campaign slogan in 1844? The vast majority of the time, none of my audiences know. He ran for office on a slogan called 54, 40, or fight. Today, we don't even know what that means. But obviously, in 1844, every American knew what it meant, else James K. Polk wouldn't have used it as his campaign slogan. What does it mean, folks? He claimed the land, all of British Columbia, up to the 54th degree of parallel, of latitude, I guess that is. I'm no latitude, yes, not longitude, but latitude. Because it was part of the contiguity and the area of the Oregon country. I'll show you the map. Terra nullius, if a land is empty, somebody first arrived would claim it. And just to back up, England claimed Australia for 140 years under this legal claim that Australia was empty when the English arrived. Well, we know that's a lie, absolute lie. Aboriginal peoples threw spears at James K. Polk, sorry, not Polk, Captain James Cook. But England used this as a lie for 140 years. Here are my 3 C's, the last 10 elements. Conquest, there is a military aspect to these legal claims. If a European country or the United States won a battle or a war against indigenous peoples, they claimed rights to that nation's lands. Christianity and the idea of civilization has always been used as an excuse to justify European and American colonization of indigenous peoples. And this is well represented in the Johnson v. McIntosh decision. So these are my 10 elements, how I analyze and how I have written about how Europeans have colonized other parts of the world. I've published an article on how Chile used these 10, how Spain used these 10 elements to colonize Chile, how Portugal used these 10 elements to colonize Brazil. And 2 years ago, I finished an article on East Africa, how Germany and England used these 10 elements of the international law of colonialism to colonize East Africa. Okay, so let's move ahead. I'm keeping my eye on the clock so I don't steal any of Brandon's times. Where did this law come from? Why did I say it's 600 years old? And again, I have to cover this pretty quickly. In the early 1400s, Spain and Portugal were starting to fight over the Canary Islands. And Portugal turned to the Pope. And King Duarte of Portugal went to the Pope and said, my gosh, if you grant me the Canary Islands, I will convert these people to Christianity. I will civilize them. I will protect them. And so the Pope bought that argument. What Pope doesn't want the Catholic Church to be larger? And so Romanus Pontifex grants Portugal the right to colonize and civilize and Christianize the Canary Island peoples. And in fact, threatens excommunication of any other Christian prince that interferes with Portugal's rights. Now, Portugal continued exploring, of course. I did that too fast. But in subsequent decades, Portugal was exploring down the west coast of Africa. So once again, they turned to now the new Pope and said, give us more papal bulls. Give us the right to colonize, Christianize, civilize, and to acquire sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. And this is exactly what the popes did in 1452, 1453, and 1455. And I'll show you the text of the 1455 papal bull. And if you don't know what a papal bull is, that's an order of the Pope that is like an order from God, I guess, and controls the church and its activities. So here's what Pope Nicholas V wrote about Portugal exploring down the west coast of Africa. It I highlighted the things that look to me like they're almost some of my elements from Johnson v. McIntosh. And perpetual slavery. Notice that. I was just in Washington, D.C., and went to the African American Museum, and they show a list of who brought the most slaves from Africa, and Portugal is the leader in pure numbers of slaves that were taken from Africa. So this was emerging international law, folks. What is international law? Even today, we still talk about it in the same way. It's what governments agree to do in their interactions with other governments. Sometimes it's by a treaty. Sometimes it's through the United Nations, maybe conventions. That's what the UN calls treaties. But sometimes governments just act against each other in what they think they're required to do. We call that a penius juris. It's sort of a common law of international law. So this doctrine of discovery, it was really just Spain and Portugal at first and the church, but they were agreeing how to control their own greed, their own explorations. So you'll notice Spain had no rights in Africa whatsoever. These papal bulls, again, threatened the Spanish monarchs with excommunication if they interfered with Portugal's property rights in Africa. So you can imagine when Columbus shows up and says, I can go west and I can find lands, that Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand paid great attention. What'd you learn in school about Columbus's voyage? Was he just looking for good prices on cinnamon and cardamom and stuff? Well, that's a falsehood that we're taught. Columbus signed 7 contracts with Isabella and Ferdinand, and spices are not mentioned until contract number 7. In contract number 1, which shows you what they really wanted, and I can quote you what it said, quote, we will make you the admiral over any lands you acquire for us, period, close quote. Isabella and Ferdinand were seeking lands they could create, they could colonize, they could make as an empire. So the moment Columbus comes back and says, I found some islands in the Caribbean, Spain goes to the new Pope, Pope Alexander VI, and he issues 4 papal bulls in 1493, granting Spain the right to these new lands it's discovered. Now, again, I highlight this because isn't that my first element from Johnson v. McIntosh? Lands undiscovered by others. That means first discovery, right? And I put the word natives there. Of course, they ignored the native nations, but these lands belong to Spain. And he also granted Spain any lands it might find in the future if they were not previously possessed by another Christian. So again, native peoples as humans, as governments, as having any rights at all, just totally ignored. Later that year, Pope Alexander VI drew a line. You can read that as well as I can. And before I show you that, I'll take that back. What'd you learn about Christopher Columbus when we were all in grade school? The earth was flat and he was going to sail off the edge. No one, gosh, I don't even know what to say, how bogus that is. Columbus knew he was headed west. They even thought he might end up in the Japans, they called it, and China, and that's where they were allegedly going to find these spices. And I've already mentioned to you, they were looking for new lands. Pope Alexander VI knew there was a North and South Pole. So I don't know where all this talk comes from about a flat earth. But he granted the lands west of the Azore Islands to Spain and title under the authority of God to all lands they would discover. And why? Why is Christianity one of my 10 elements? Look at the last line. This was holy and laudable work to contribute to the expansion of Christianity. Now I'm going to show you the map now that Pope drew. If you've studied international law at all, you've heard the phrase, the line of demarcation. When I first started doing this work 20 some years ago, I had never studied much of international law. I had never heard the phrase line of demarcation. The line of demarcation is the dotted line in the Atlantic that Pope Alexander VI drew in 1493. I didn't make this map. I borrowed it from online on the computer. Portugal refused to comply with that line. And so look to the left side, you can see that Spain and Portugal signed a treaty 1 year later at the Spanish town of Tordesillas, and they moved that line to the bold red line, 500 miles to the west. And now I'm going to ask you, What language do they speak in Brazil to this day? What language do they speak in the rest of the New World? Until now today you get to the United States. So you can see that those lines drawn by the Pope and then drawn by Spain and Portugal had a major impact on colonization and international boundaries that we still honor to this day. Now, Brazil is a little larger than that map shows, of course, and Spain and Portugal did a bit. In Uruguay and Paraguay, they fought who would control those lands. But they pretty much, it's much cheaper to just divide stuff up. Greta, let me pick Brandon. So Brandon and I are going to come over to your house, Greta, and we're going to decide to take it. I'll keep the first floor, and Brandon can have the top floor. And we're going to put our cross and our flag out in our religious symbol and our tribal flags out in your front yard. We're going to claim it. What do you think of that? Okay. That's a rhetorical question. You could hear her laugh. No, she doesn't think much of that. Okay, that's what was going on, folks. I'm going to move more quickly because I want to cover Lewis and Clark more. England, I've already mentioned Queen Elizabeth I. She wanted her share of the New World. Henry VII, a Catholic monarch, worried about being excommunicated. In 1496, he still sent John Cabot to the West, and he landed from allegedly Newfoundland in modern-day Canada to about Virginia in modern-day United States. Every few hundred miles, he rode ashore, flag and cross, this is ours, we'll be back. And in fact, the charter that he gave Cabot kind of copied some of the language of the papal bulls. Well, not surprising, because this was emerging international law. He told the Cabots, go where no Christian prince has yet been, and acquire from me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. Elizabeth I did the same thing when she chartered Roanoke Island. I think it was Sir Walter Raleigh. It was certainly Sir Humphrey Gilbert that attempted the first American colony in 1587. She copied the same language her grandfather, Henry VII, had used. Now, if you know much about the English monarchy, Elizabeth was not Catholic. She was Protestant and was already excommunicated. But she still complied with this emerging international law that Spain and Portugal and the church had created. Not because she was Catholic anymore, but she wanted her explorations and her empire to be recognized. James I, who chartered most of our 13 original colonies, used the same argument, told his people, go where no Christian princes yet been, acquire for me sovereignty and jurisdiction. And he also used as an excuse to dominate the native nations was Christianity as the right religion and the idea of contiguity, which I'll show you on the American map in a moment. I'll skip that stuff. I cannot help but give a talk anymore without showing this letter from General George Washington. And so I'm going to cover this very quickly. He wrote this letter of advice to the Articles of Confederation Congress in September of 1783, giving them advice on how we should proceed now that the Revolutionary War was over and we had signed the treaty with England, guaranteeing our existence. On page 4 of this letter, he starts talking about the U.S. moving to the West. And at that time, he was talking about just to the Mississippi River. But what's he saying is going to happen to Native people? They will retreat. And it's cheaper for us to buy their lands than to fight them in wars. Look what he says there. Settlement of the Western country and making peace with the Indians. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. So plainly, they knew that strong tribal nations were out there. How were they going to acquire these lands? He's recommending peace treaties instead of war. I guess I don't even want you to read all this. The point I'm mainly showing you is he compared Indians to animals. This letter is called the savage as the wolf letter because that's what he called us. Now look how he's saying, look, as we advance our borders, the wild beasts of the forest disappear. And he says the same thing's going to happen with the savage as the wolf. And here's the chilling part, to me anyway. What do you think? Both animals and Indians are beasts of prey. Wow. Okay. Thank you, Father of our country. Okay. Again, looking at my clock, I only have, how much time, Greta, should I take? I mean, we had the introduction, so I have 10 minutes or do I have only 6?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. So Jefferson, as Secretary of State, I've already mentioned this point. In his discussion with the British ambassador about the lands south of the Great Lakes, inside recognized American borders, he said the Hudson's Bay company's got to get out of there. He also knew this idea that the United States held the option to buy tribal lands, but they did not own the fee simple title. Remember back to my elements, what I called preemption or European title? Jefferson used this word preemption several times. And our very first Congress passed a law about Indian affairs on July 22, 1790. And our very first Congress used this same word preemption, meaning the same thing. The United States had the only right to buy tribal lands. If and when native nations died out or chose to sell, they could only sell to their discoverer, or in this case, we inherited English discovery rights through the treaty that ended our Revolutionary War. In fact, you may not know this, folks, but in that treaty that ended our Revolutionary War, England granted us all its proprietary rights from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. What proprietary rights did England have west of the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains up to the Mississippi River? There were almost no Englishmen out there at that time, 1783. So King George III was literally talking about his right of preemption, his right to buy those lands. He was talking the Doctrine of Discovery. President Jefferson told chiefs, many chiefs visited him in the White House. He told them all, you own your lands. You ever want to sell, we will buy. Treaties that the Jefferson administration signed with tribes had those provisions in them. If Tribe X ever wants to sell, it can only sell to the United States, not to an American citizen, not to a foreign citizen, not to a foreign government. So the Jefferson administration was advocating and demanding its preemption rights. I've already mentioned this pamphlet that Jefferson wrote that came out in 1804. Oh, it's called, yeah, now I remember the name. It's called The Limits and Boundaries of Louisiana. He was tracing the French explorations and the establishment of New Orleans so that he could make a contiguity argument to the entire drainage system of the Mississippi River. In 1808, he wrote Congress about the lands west of the Mississippi that were inside the Louisiana Territory. Did he claim that he had bought the fee simple title and the lands from France in our Louisiana Treaty? No. In fact, folks, what did we buy from France? We bought the preemption power to be the purchaser when tribes wanted to sell or would sell. So he writes Congress in 1808, we've got to buy the land west of the Mississippi from the, quote, native proprietors, owners. Okay, I'm going to try to move faster because I want to get to Lewis and Clark. When Meriwether Lewis left Washington, D.C. in June of 1803, the Louisiana Treaty had not been agreed to yet. And so Jefferson was getting passports for Lewis and Clark to cross the Louisiana Territory, tried to get passports from Spain, England, and France, because we didn't really know where the Lewis and Clark would go. But now that we made the Louisiana Purchase and France had sold us their rights in the West, he writes Meriwether Lewis a letter in the winter. Lewis is waiting in St. Louis to head up the Missouri River. And look what Jefferson wrote. He said, hey, I want to tell you about this treaty we just signed with France. You don't have to worry about France anymore because look, quote, being now become sovereigns of the territory. So he knew what he'd bought from France, not just the preemption right and the right to buy the lands from native nations, but the right to be the overarching sovereign. But he still recognized, look what he told Lewis, but it's subject to Indian rights of occupancy. So he knew that native peoples, native nations still had that native title, the right to live on the lands as long as they wished. Now, here's the map I wanted to show you. Look at the Louisiana Territory. It's the stuff in yellow, not the stuff that's the Indiana Territory, but it's the stuff west of the Mississippi. That is the drainage system of the Mississippi River. That is the contiguity element of the Doctrine of Discovery. So you may only know of Lewis and Clark, but the United States sent 4 expeditions attempting to trace these borders. You probably know the name Lieutenant Zebulon Pike. He went along the Arkansas River to modern day Colorado. He went up the Mississippi River to its very headwaters. I think we were shocked that such a mighty river didn't go any further north than that. And then Jefferson sent another expedition called Dunbar and Scott, and they went along the Red River in the middle of Texas there. So Jefferson was trying to find out what the contiguity, what this size and boundaries of the Louisiana Territory was. But look at the Oregon country. Why do all the maps call that? Why did we claim British Columbia? Look at the drainage system of the Columbia River. And that is exactly why Jefferson targeted Lewis and Clark at the mouth. And it's why John Jacob Astor, of course, decided to build Astoria. Okay, I see it's 8:40, so I'm going to try to end real quickly. Lewis and Clark made also.
Bob, Brandon just lost power, so his power just went out. So you have as long as you want while he tries to. Hopefully, his power goes back on shortly.
Oh, you mean in his house or something?
Yeah, we have a big storm happening here, and he just lost power to his house.
Oh my gosh. Well, we have a terrible storm here. It was only 71 today, too. No, sorry, folks. Oh, well, then I can take a breath and slow down a little bit.
Absolutely.
So Lewis and Clark, Jefferson tells them to go to the mouth of the Columbia River. They take medals of Jefferson. Maybe you've seen these. There used to be one at the Oregon Historical Society, but it was repatriated to some tribes. I have a copy of one right here in my office. Oh, man. Here, I just got to show it to you. These are called Jefferson Peace Medals. Where's my camera? You've probably seen these before. I don't know if they're shining or whatever, but they took about 55 of these with them, big ones, to give to who they thought was the most important chief. Mid-sized ones that they gave to the middle chief. I think this is a mid-sized one. And then small ones for the smaller chiefs. Look on the back, it says peace and friendship. And it looks like a native person's hand shaking the hand of what looks like a military uniform. They showed these medals and, like I said, gave them out to who they thought the chiefs were. And they said, this is your new father. The French and Spanish have left and will never return. So this is the message Jefferson told Lewis and Clark to deliver to all the tribal nations they encountered. Jefferson was very concerned with this and directed Lewis and Clark to do this. Be as nice as they could to every native that they met, try to avoid problems and deliver this sovereignty message. So this is my sovereignty element number 4 of Johnson v. McIntosh. Your new great father is this guy here. The French and the Spanish used to hand out medals too. And Lewis and Clark tried to take them back, or they said it's not proper for you to wear those anymore. Now, folks, the next time you see a painting of a chief, anytime you look for paintings of the chiefs, I always look for these peace medals. So maybe that'll give you something to look for in the future. We made peace medals for presidents from President Washington until I think 1893, which would have been Benjamin Henry Harrison, I think. And they were used in the Indian trade. Now, Lewis and Clark also gave, let me back up. So there were 50 big meetings with tribal nations that lasted 2 and 3 days long. And Lewis and Clark would show their weapons. Their men would march in military style, and the tribes would show their ceremonies, etc., whatever. But the speech that Meriwether Lewis delivered was written down in the journals. You can read word for word a 2,500 word speech that Lewis wrote that's in the journals. And the message I've just delivered to you is exactly what they told Native leaders. You are now subject to us. Jefferson's your new great white father. You deal with us from now on. We want things to be wonderful, cozy, and everything. Now, I have my second point. Why did Meriwether Lewis, why'd they build those forts at Fort Mandan? This is in western North Dakota, folks. It's where they spent the first winter of 1804-05. They didn't live with native peoples in the nice warm wooden huts or earthen huts that the Mandan Nation was famous for. They built a wooden fort, froze to death nearly, at the Pacific coast. Why didn't they live in some nice, cool, or nice, dry Chinook longhouses? 100 feet long, the Chinook had at the Pacific coast, cedar longhouses. But they built the wooden Fort Clatsop. Maybe you've been there and seen the recreation that's there. I think they were proving more elements of the Doctrine of Discovery. Actual occupancy, an American building, an American facility. I'm not sure I finished my thought about China, but China not only just has put its flag on the South China Sea, China is building up islands there by bringing in landfill and dirt and stuff and sand. And China is building buildings on these islands in the South China Sea, and they're putting soldiers there. So China has made a first discovery claim, they claim, and they're trying to back it up with actual occupancy. So the Doctrine of Discovery in 2024, wow. I mentioned Lewis's branding iron already when I was talking a little faster. Get a picture of it. Go down to Portland and see it at the Oregon Historical Society. What an interesting way to show where you've been. Sticking a flag and a cross in the beach isn't much proof you've been there. You pull that flag and cross out and get back on your ship, and the next wave wipes out evidence you were there. But you start branding things. In fact, at the mouth of the Columbia River on November 9th, 1805, Lewis Clark took a couple men and went 9 miles up the Washington Peninsula there. And he carved on a tree, William Clark from the United States, November 9, 1805. And, so why was he doing that? Was that just graffiti? No, that's making territorial claims. Now, my biggest piece of evidence is what I'm going to show you. When they got ready to leave Fort Clatsop and go back to the United States, and every man that was keeping a journal knew they had left the United States when they crossed the Rocky Mountains. Now, why is that? Because that was the contiguous boundaries of the Louisiana Territory. They all knew they were in territory that was claimed by Russia, Spain, England, and the United States. So when they're getting ready to leave Fort Clatsop, all of them write, we're returning to the United States. And then Meriwether Lewis wrote this document. And he hung one of them in Fort Clatsop, and he gave other copies to the chiefs. He says, if any white man shows up, give him this. And here's what the document said.
Also, not to interrupt everyone's reading, but we do have Brandon back. He got power restored.
Okay, well, then I can try to end in like about 1 minute. So this document on the backside is the list of all 33 people that went to the Pacific coast. Sacagawea's name's on it, her baby, the slave York, who was Captain Clark's slave, his name. So what's this list of these people's names? What's it for? This is evidence that the United States had actually occupied the mouth of the Columbia River and now had a contiguity claim alleged under international law to the entire drainage system. So I'm going to try to end right here. Here's what our claims were based on. Robert Gray first found the Columbia River. We think the Spanish later claimed they had found it 25 years earlier, but they never publicized it. And we don't even know if that's true. But Robert Gray sailed 25 miles up the Columbia River in 1792. First discovery. Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark to start actual occupancy. And then John Jacob Astor does actually occupy it. So now the United States had a claim to the entire territory. Gosh, if you want to buy 2 books that I've been involved in, there's one. And this one I wrote with indigenous professors from Australia, Canada, and New Zealand about the Doctrine of Discovery in the English colonies. But if you're interested in Lewis and Clark and Jefferson and American Manifest Destiny, that's the book I published in 2006. Thank you very much. Brandon, I hope I filled in for you. Glad you got power back. I'm going to, let's see, how do I get rid of my slides? Oh, stop share. Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bob. Really informative. Brandon, we'll hand it over to you and you can share your screen when you're ready.
All right, we'll do that. I'll tell you, Bob, that was an extraordinary presentation. I learned so much that you are definitely a tough act to follow here.
Ah,
Uh,
thank you.
that was a great presentation. Um, I will share mine. I'm going to keep my screen off just because of um, power, just to limit um, what. Let's see. Oh, there's my family. Sorry, I've seen everything. Oh, shoot. Now I lost. Let's get that big. Let's see. I have a lovely screen here in my way. Thank you very much. Move. There we go. And then presentation wise. So I'm going to keep my screen up. Just bandwidth is still not fully back up. So I do apologize for not showing my face, but hopefully you all will at least be able to see the slides um, as well. Start here. Greta, can you guys all see the slides?
Yep, yep.
Okay,
They look great.
perfect. So that's not the beginning. Let's go back to the beginning here. There we go. So this one is the Doctrine of Discovery. I've titled this one the Doctrine of Discovery. Esquabapshiaptis Puyallup Chud Duflala Olabadi. So we traditionally introduce ourselves in our language. Hasachel, Brandon Reynon Titsta. I am the Siab Duflala Olabadi. And so my name is Brandon Reynon. I'm a Puyallup tribal member. And this is a story about the Squabapsh and the Puyallupapsh, the Swiftwater people, or the people at the people at the bend of the river. And this is just our story about the Doctrine of Discovery. And I will preface that this is information I've gained over. I've been doing this 16 years, and this is information I've gained not just for myself, my own research, but has been passed down from my predecessors, such as Judy Wright, the late Judy Wright. And so, oral tradition is one of the ways in which we share our knowledge. And so, have her to thank for a lot of this information that you see today. I also like to have fun in my presentation, so you'll see nice little memes over here now and then. And so you see here, Native Americans, what gives you the right to take our land? And Americans says the Holy Bible, with good old Optimus Prime there. So the Doctrine of Discovery, also known as the Manifest Destiny, we see that a lot, and heard a lot about these. Heard these phrases a lot in Bob's presentation. You see it a lot where they refer to this land as a virgin land, uninhabited, ripe for exploration, never before seen, untouched land. But as Bob alluded to in his presentation as well, we know that was completely inaccurate, as he referred to the Australian Aboriginals there down in Australia with the English. Here, the Squabapsh, the population in 1492, right around when Columbus would have been coming in this area, I estimate to be right around 35,000. And that consisted of villages from Caronlet to Vashon Island there. So all those areas in between, like Gig Harbor. The Puyallup population in 1492 was roughly 65,000. That is covering a much larger land base. That would be going all the way from present day Point Defiance up to like Carbonado, to the west, to the east. North would be probably up to the Green River, and down south to the Nisqually River. So this was a much broader area. So hence the double in population. However, when you think about that 35,000, such a small area, I'm a very firm believer that the Squabopsh were a much larger people than the Puyallupapsh. Just the Puyallupapsh had much more land to work with. Where the Squabopsh, especially there in Quartermaster Harbor between your guys' main harbor there on Vashon, that was the central economic hub for the Squabopsh, and you had the Puyallupapsh there across the Bay of Clemenceau Bay. And there was much trade going in between. These terms, Squabopsh and Puyallupapsh, these were just place names. it was really not until the U.S. comes through and kind of divides us up that we really to separate the two populations. So when I talk about Squabopsh and Puyallup, really we were talking about the same group of people. They were closely related. They were closely interactive with one another. Marriage, all that sort of stuff. We had yearly and consistent competitions with one another across the Narrows, where the ferries go today between Point Defiance and Tahlequah. Those are both very large village sites on both terminuses there for the ferry. Those two populations were very well known for in our oral history of competing one with one another, even in like what I'd compare them today to be in either Highland Games from from Europe or just the Olympic Games in general. So these were definitely not uninhabited or untouched lands as the concept of manifest destiny would have you believe. The arrival, I start much more recent than Bob's presentation because we were later discovered, as the posted would say. You had the arrival of Lewis and Clark. I'm glad Bob went into much more detail, and it was very awesome to hear all the what goes in the what went into the Lewis and Clark expedition. Um, there were when they arrived, I should say before this, we had the arrival of George Vancouver in 1792. So just a decade or so before Lewis and Clark arrived out here. That was our first interaction with a posted or a white person or non-native person. However, we do have interactions with Asia as well as even some Russian trade partners that we had. Mostly see those up in the Macaw and the Cowichan area up there in British Columbia, but we also spoke a little bit of Russian. Vancouver, when he arrives in 1792, and Peter Puget passes the knowledge on to him of our location. We greet him in what Vancouver describes as somewhat sounding like Russian. And we were trying to speak what we had heard. So we clearly had interactive with other countries. So England was not the first to arrive in this area. But so then Lewis and Clark come along in 1804. We had not seen a posted since, or had heard, but we had heard about these two postads, this group of postads that had come in. But none of us, we don't have any story in our history that talks about their arrival. However, we know through Bob's presentation what the purpose was here or why they came here. But then it is not for another decade or so when the Hudson Bay Company arrives in 1820. That's our first real interaction with the posted of the non-natives. And they come, all they want is fur. They're wanting resources. They are not actively searching to take land. They're actively searching to trade and use the land. And so this actually creates a nice kind of a symbiotic or at least a mutually beneficial relationship between the Hudson Bay Company and the tribes here, and to the point that many headmen are having fur traders marry their daughters. And in fact, I am a descendant of those from the Dillon line from the Hudson Bay Company, the McLeod line from the Hudson Bay Company are, we're all Hudson Bay men who married headmen of both the Puyallup and the Nisqually. But there was relative peace between the tribes and Hudson Bay Company. But then the arrival of the Americans in the 1850, that's where the manifest destiny really, and the Doctrine of Discovery policies that we have heard from Bob really come into play. The Americans come, and in 1850 with the mentality that God has sent them here, that God has led them to this area, and so the Indians need to move, and so the concept that we as a wild people who are uncivilized are needing to be removed, and we are simply in the way of the American expansion west. And then it's like this little meme down here on the bottom here when they realize how they only got here because of Sacagawea. Um, so again, this is what we hear a lot. We hear a lot in our oral history. We see it a lot in the written documents. Um, this is God's will, manifest destiny. The arrival of the non-natives here is strictly because God has led them here. And they begin taking the land. They begin forcing us off, setting up boundaries, setting fences, laying claim to lands because the U.S. government has told them that they can come out here. The Donation Land Act of 1850 gives every white male 640 acres, every married couple 1,280 acres, just because they want and because they can come out and be given it. The U.S. government has given them this permission. A government which we have no idea who they're really talking about. Who is this? Who is this person you're talking? Who is this gray white father? Who is this? What are you? Who are you? What is this country you're talking about? The United States. We've never heard of this. And I did find it interesting during Bob's presentation about how all these laws that are being set up by European nations, just how I mean, just how oh, I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of right now, but just uh, they come out here applying these laws on this land. Uh, there was no consultation. It was just, we thought of these laws and therefore we are going to exercise these laws. Not understanding that there were laws here, there were civilizations here. It's just baffling to me, the mentality that existed in the 1817 and 1800s, or even as we saw back into the 1400s. But this was all justified because God said, so there's this religious backed theft, as I put here. These lands could be claimed in the name of Christianity. We were not considered human, and so we were savages. We needed to be made Christian. And one way, and it's hard for many people to understand, but rape and purposefully trying to breed out the native was something that occurred very much in this area. Of course, then there's the murder and deceit, hate, and the forced removal of our Puyallup people off our land. Again, all in the name of Christianity. And what I find ironic in all this is that manifest destiny was limited. The concept and the benefits of manifest destiny were limited to Posteds only, the non-native only, Caucasians. It's even noted in this little meme down here, ironically, that these people did not include Mexicans, as they're talking about, California in the South there. They were not, they were treated just the same. And so natives up here, the concept that God could love anybody but white people was so foreign to them that when they saw other humans, they thought of us lesser than humans. And so therefore, in the name of God, they could take over and murder and steal, which is, again, as ironic, being a Christian myself, thinking about the Ten Commandments. They were well in existence back. Even the Pope himself had to obey the Ten Commandments, and it seemed as the Ten Commandments applied until it was beneficial not to have them apply, and then that was okay. So that brings, so the concept of manifest destiny is carried throughout. You'll see this throughout my presentation. It does not go away. Manifest destiny, Doctrine of Discovery. These continue to apply now into the 1850s. Treaty language is heavy in Christian terminology and ideology. We are gifted by the grace of God the opportunity to be educated in the non-native, ways, as an act of charity. We are promised in the Medicine Creek Treaty medicine. We had medicine. We didn't need anyone else's medicine. We were able to, but of course, it was not medicine approved by the American or the Christian um, religious beliefs. And so ours were pagan, or ours were savage style medicines. Therefore, they couldn't be blessed of God, and therefore they couldn't be considered good for you. We were promised again education. We were promised all these lands. Promised small portions of lands. If all we did is give our lands, we would get some lands, and they would never harm us again. They would never talk, never. Uh, they would leave us alone if we just move off into these small reservations. We, of course, we weren't dumb. We understood what was going on. And so we went to war, and I have highlight here the treaty wars of 1855 to 1856. Most of the Squaps and Puyallups go to Fox Island to the internment camp, where, in the name of God again, those Indians are in this internment camp to be Christianized and to be rewarded for not fighting against them. But they're not considered human enough for their provided food or shelter. And so this, just like we think of internment camps in World War II, the same exact things are happening here at Fox Island, where women, children, elderlies, they were all being mistreated. Some men did go and fight with Leshai in the battle. And this is one of those rare instances where the battle and the tribes resulted in a win. We defeated the U.S. Army that came out. We defeated the territorial militia for Washington, and our reservation was enlarged from 12,000 or 1,200 acres all the way to 60,000 acres. However, because giving us that much land was problematic for the new territory of Washington, and the plan for the city of Tacoma, it was reduced to 18,000 without consultation. And again, all justified because it was for a righteous cause of establishing the city of Tacoma and allowing more settlers to come west as God had desired. And then it just continues up and through from 1857 to 1940s. Main thing being the railroad, taking lands without permission. Again, the murder, the deceit, all in the name of progress. So Manifest Destiny now is now called Progress. It's all the same principles. Take the land because it's what God wants us to do. God needs our people to go here faster, move here faster. And so we're going to build a railroad. And the only way we can build a railroad is to build it right through the Puyallup Reservation. And that's the only way to connect it. The best route is through the Puyallup Reservation. So in the name of God, we're going to take over this reservation. But again, here I was the refusal to acknowledge tribal nations. They're just plotting land, as Bob put in his presentation. They were just coming and saying, "Hey, we want this. We need this land here, and if you don't like it, we're going to kill you." There was lots of tribe members that were killed. They had set up many villages along the routes that we know as the railroad today. And when they refused to move, they were killed. And then, Manifest Destiny really comes to probably its worst time in our history. And that's why I now call in this slide, I meant it now takes on the name of genocide. Boarding schools were set up in the 1860. Again, these were we needed to educate, speaking from the U.S. Point of view, we needed to educate the Native Americans in this country because they believed in their beliefs were pagan. They were non-Christian, and so therefore they had to be educated correctly. And so the boarding schools were set up because the previous tactics were not working. Tribes were not going away. Tribes are still organizing themselves. We were definitely dwindling in number, but we're still holding on. And so the United States chose to attack the vulnerable, and imprison the adults to force this genocide. Children were forced to go to boarding schools, and if they didn't, their parents were arrested or beaten and hung. Um, if their children ran away and the parents did not return them to the school, they were beaten or hung. Again, it's all justified. This is justifiable murder because this is in the name of Christianity. We're trying to do better. We're trying to help we're trying to take the savage out of these people and make them human. These are direct quotes that you see from all these the journals and the newspapers you have from the time when that we were considered sea wash, which was a term used because we were still not human. The purpose of the boarding schools was to train children, and they didn't train us in how to be lawyers and how to be doctors. They trained us how to be servants, taught the women how to wash dishes properly, how to act as a woman, and how to serve dinners and clean houses. The men were taught how to, in mill work. They were taught how um, uh, to weld and to do steel work. All the jobs that were to do yard work and those sort of things. Work that the POS did, the non-natives did not want to do. And then this still didn't work. And so we still persevered. We still endured. I refer to the children in these boarding schools. If you've ever been to our museum, we refer to them as our children warriors. Just as the warriors survived and the warriors persevered and won the Treaty Wars of 1855 and 1856. These children warriors won the war against the U.S. government and their attempt of genocide. They practiced their religion, they practiced their language, they maintained their familiar relations and their relationships at night, despite being beaten, raped, and murdered, and enslaved and encaged for doing so. Every Puyallup, every Native American in this country who is here today is most likely a relative or a descendant of a boarding school warrior that survived and endured those times. During these times, our land was under attack as well. We have the Puyallup Land Act of 1886, which divided up the reservation into allotments. And then that was so successful in taking the land away from the tribe that eventually becomes the Dawes Act of 1887. The Puyallup Tribe was not particularly part of the Dawes Act because of the Land Act of 1886. And in fact, the Dawes Act forbade the sale of tribal lands until 1904. However, because the United States was, needing lumber, such as for cities of New York, Boston, San Francisco, it was actually petitioned, and the Puyallup Land Act of 1890 was approved, and so Puyallup land was able to be sold before the Dawes Act permitted it. They divided the land into allotments. And again, the purpose of this was to help the natives, help the Puyallups understand how to be civilized, allow them to sell property, allow them to make money, help them to become human, and most importantly, become Christian. I point out here that merciless Indian savages wanted to point this is actually quote from the Declaration of Independence. That's how the U.S. government thought of all natives. We were just merciless Indian savages. We were, as we saw in Bob's presentation from George Washington, we were just beasts, violent beasts, comparable to wild animals, or as we saw, wolves. And it's funny that both Bob and I hint on this is when you think about Happy Columbus Day, celebrate by going to the wrong house, then claiming it as your own. This is exactly what happened to the tribes, not just here in Puyallup and Squabosh, but also to nations throughout our tribal nations throughout this country. The Indian Reorganization Act acknowledges only certain tribes. The Puyallup tribe as a beneficiary. However, the Squabosh were not. The Squabosh were deemed that they didn't exist anymore. We know that's not true. The Squabosh continue to live on Vashon Island and the Gig Harbor area. The Squally family, for instance, is one. They still are here today. They are still, in fact, one of their a Squabopsh sits on tribal council. Her descendancy is through the Squabopsh and through the Puyallup. The Squabopsh were forced off of Vashon Island and into the Puyallup Reservation that we know today. And being the typical native, we were forbidden to leave our reservation. Stevens put that in the treaty, and we after we won the war, we said, no, we're not going to listen to that either. And so a lot of Squash go back to Vashon Island and continue to live there. But in the Indian Reorganization Act, tribes that agreed to it had to formulate constitutions that were approved by the U.S. government. And so when you look at the Puyallup Tribe Constitution, it sure looks a whole lot like the U.S. Constitution. That was on purpose. In order to become a recognized sovereign nation, you had to, be like us. And so the U.S. government controlled what we could put in our Constitution. And then our government had to have a democracy. It's interesting. A lot of our chiefs, as we're there, we called them headmen after the arrival of the pasta. They were called chiefs. We had headmen, and there could be multiple headmen and women as leadership. Sometimes 20 to 30 leaders at a time, just depending on what it was. That was forbidden, and you could have a council. But in 1934, they were limited to 5. It wasn't until late 1990s that we petitioned, after many petitions to the U.S. government. The U.S. government finally allowed us to get to 7. And so, I mean, there's just to have our own government, it takes a lot, but we have to make sure that's approved by the U.S. Government. And so again, here we have manifest destiny continues. We have, the U.S. government is continually up until this time, this is 1930s, forcing us to follow what they want as the nation that has come over and planted their flag. And then it starts taking on different. This is still the concept of manifest destiny. We see it now in the 1970s. I'll highlight here. A commercial fisherman, he's still alive, so I didn't want to put his name in here, but he's quoted as saying, "These fish are my fish. Those fish are my fish. God made these fish for us." These are the same concepts that we have. That's how this government, that's how this area was taken over by the U.S. government. It was this same exact mentality. Everything you see is God gave it to us. Civil rights era, manifest destiny continued. As I say here, the fishing rights, the civil rights wars. Non-native fishermen believe that they are entitled to fish because it's their God-given right to work as the fisher in the fisheries. Native fishermen are seen as a problem. They're seen as dogs taken away from the non-native livelihood. Heavy fishing started to decimate salmon populations. At one point, the salmon are considered so much that the fish would never die. There would be fish forever. And so they continue to fish. The non-native fishermen continue to fish that way. And then our fishing village was attacked on September 9th, 1970, while the men were out fishing. The Department of Fish and Wildlife and county and state policemen converged on our fishing village down there near downtown Tacoma. And they attacked and arrested women and elderly because their husbands were out fishing. They were beaten, and then they were taken down to Olympia by the busload for fishing. That was their crime. This, of course, was heralded by the non-native fishermen because the native fishermen were taking all the catch. And then we have the Bolt decision in 1974, where finally someone stood up for us, a real active, actual Christianity by Judge Bolt, saying that the tribes are entitled to 50% of the fish catch. This, of course, angered the non-native fishermen, and how they were upset that the savages, such as the tribes, could have equal right to the fish. That was definitely not. That was against what the God-given right that non-native apostates had to the fish. And this, of course, led to attack on tribal fishermen. You had the non-native fishermen claiming poverty. Bold decision had bankrupted them because how dare they take 50% of the fish. Non-native fishermen were blaming tribes for the lack of fish. However, it's very well documented that while tribes were catching fish by the hundreds, non-native fishermen were catching fish by the tens of thousands. Yet, again, in the name of Christianity, in the name of their God-given right to fish, it could not possibly be. And so they were blinded by that notion that taking the fish was by taking overfishing was the problem, and they put their blame on the tribes. And then we still see these same concepts today with tribal gaming. I just wanted to point out that taxation, tribes are taxed. There's limitation and oversight by the federal government. Tribes must provide funding to neighboring jurisdictions. When you go to Vegas and Atlantic City, how many of those casinos and those resorts do you see are required and limited by the federal government to do with their money? Tribes are limited by the federal government how the revenue is used. Does that same restrictions put on Vegas casinos or Atlantic City casinos? No, they're allowed to do and build these massive resorts. Tribes, nope, sorry, you can only spend and you can only have access to 55% of all your revenue. What happens to the rest of the revenue? Where does that go? Imagine if Vegas and Atlantic City were held to those same standards of only having 55% of their revenue available to be used. And then the shareholder restrictions. You can have as many shareholders as you want if you're a Vegas or Atlantic City casino. Then I finish with the question is why? And again, here, just the same concepts of manifest destiny to ensure proper, the outline, this is a quote, to ensure proper use and care of tribal resources. Do they care about how Vegas and Atlantic City casinos are using their resources? No. And it's because, and I quoted the Medicine Creek Treaty, and this is still the concept. We as Native nations still have to battle this perception from the U.S. government as being little children, that we cannot take care of ourselves, that we need the U.S. government's charitable views and acts of charity to survive, and it's just not the case. So that is the end of my presentation, but it's just one of those things where we talk about the doctrine of discovery, we talk about manifest destiny as if it's a thing of the past, but it by no means is. It's something that still continues to this day. It's something that we continue to fight, but just as our ancestors have always done, we will continue to be here. We are here. We will continue to be here forever. The U.S. government may one day fall, but the tribal governments will always be here. Hoyafchut, I am finished.
Thank you so much, Bob, Brandon, for sharing your insights and knowledge with the Vashon Mary Island Heritage Museum and our communities. We really appreciate it. And we hope that we'll be able to bring you back sometime in the future. I posted Robert's books in the chat for those of you in attendance who want to find those online. Want to give Robert, Brandon, one more chance. Anything you'd like to say in closing?
We'll plan the next event during the Strawberry Festival so Molly and I can be there.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll make sure to do that. Okay, well, thank you so much. And everybody have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Goodbye.